Texas is often seen as one of America's most conservative states, a place where Republican politics, religious moralism, and rugged individualism seem almost baked into its identity. But has this always been the case? Today's guest challenges that view, uncovering a forgotten radical history of cowboys on strike, farmers fighting corporate power, socialist organizing, and class struggle in the Lone Star State. His new book is The Myth of Red Texas, and he is a returning guest, journalist, political commentator, and now published author, David Griscom. I'm Patrick Needham.
And I'm Djene and Patrick.
And you're listening to Talking History. Welcome, David.
Thank you all so much for having me back on. Really happy to be here.
So last time we had you on, David, you were talking a little bit about the research that you were doing for this book, talking about some of the organizing that Cowboys done. But now, obviously you have published your book, and basically it is an attempt to challenge the idea that Texas has always been this naturally conservative part of the country. So, I guess starting out, I would want to ask, from your research, what is perhaps the biggest misconception people have about Texas's political history?
Yeah, I think that when people think about Texas, they think about a few things. They think about, social conservatism in politics, but they also think about a very strong commitment to, let's call it free market economics, to capitalism. But when capitalism, that is the system that we have in Texas today, when that came into the state of Texas, it was pretty fiercely resisted. Things like the enclosure of the open range sparked an incredible uprising amongst poor and working class cowboys. The changes in the debt system that came into Texas sparked an incredible agrarian uprising. And as I note in the book, Texas had two major third-party movements that overtook the Republican Party and became the second major party in Texas, one being the People's Party in the 1890s and then the Socialist Party in the 1910s. So today, when we see figures running on an economic populist brand of politics, or even Democratic Socialists running for office, we have a few elected officials here in Texas who are Democratic Socialists. When we see folks like that, one of the things that is often said is like, oh, this is a reflection of the national environment, California or New York ideas coming to Texas. But as I argue in the book, these kind of politics, these kind of ideas have been a part of our history from the very, very beginning. And rather than not having existed, there has been a long time concerted effort to kind of marginalize and cover up this history.
So you mentioned cowboys, farmers, socialist organizing, labor organizing, part of this radical past in Texas. What story really stood out to you and surprised you the most? What caught you the most off guard when you were researching this topic?
So I think really the genesis of the book for me was the story of the fence cutters. So the fence cutting wars, as they're known, was a massive uprising across the state of Texas. You had very significant amounts of fence cutting. What is fence cutting? It's exactly what the name sounds like. People were cutting down barbed wire fences. Barbed wire comes into Texas in the 1870s and really explodes in the 1880s. And it was used because you were able to kind of fence in large amounts of land. Before there was a kind of a physical there was a physical limitation on how much land you could enclose because you need to have wood or stone. Barbed wire allowed you to fence in miles and miles and miles and miles of land. This new invention comes into Texas at the same period as this new large landowning class is coming in. So you have the railroad companies, but you also have a lot of syndicates and northern and European capital coming into Texas, buying up a lot of the land because it was dirt cheap. And they're using this barbed wire to kind of separate their parcels off. But they weren't just fencing in their own land. They were oftentimes in, spurts and in a kind of land grabbing mania, would just fence in whatever they could get their hand on hands-on. And what that meant for working class cowboys is it meant that they weren't able to get their cattle to market. They weren't able to get their cattle to water sources. So at first, cowboys start cutting fences just to get their cattle from point A to point B. And in Texas, there was an idea, like a lot of parts of the West, of the open range, the idea that there should be large swaths of land that are just kind of held in common. So the cowboys at first are just cutting fences on a practical basis, but very quickly do it for political reasons. So wherever they saw fencing, they would cut it down. They organized themselves into gangs, the Blue Devils, the Javelinas, and my personal favorites, the Knights of the Nippers. Eventually, these big landowners start hiring goons and to defend their fencing, and this war becomes a hot war. And all across the state of Texas, you could hear pops in the middle of the night, fence cutters being fired upon by employees and hired goons for these big landowning operations. The fence cutting wars get kind of violently put down by the Texas Rangers, and the Texas legislature passes a whole host of laws, notably making fence cutting a felony, while taking land that doesn't belong to you, fencing land that doesn't belong to you, just a simple misdemeanor. So really is just a kind of an early example in Texas of the kind of class nature of our legal system and the way that the police and the Texas Rangers are utilized. But one of the reasons that this kind of inspired the book is, one, it's a very fascinating story. But if you go and you read a lot of the kind of popular histories of the fence cutting wars, it's often presented as a story of how law and order came to the state of Texas because, the Texas Rangers are putting down all these ruffians. Well, if you think about it, if you are somebody who's a 6th, 7th generation Texan, you're probably way more likely to be related to a fence cutter than you are to a Texas Ranger. And that was kind of what led me down this path of wanting to tell this other story of Texas history, because I think the way that we kind of view ourselves in our own history really does matter. And you can see the many ways where we're kind of presented with a very specific narrative of what it means to be a Texan and what Texas history is. That is challenged by this story and many, many others in the book.
So what you're saying is that sort of the popular view that is at least prevailing is, a story of how Texas became civilized and how, groups like the fence cutters were, these hangovers from the Wild West, a more barbarian past, and that it was a kind of good thing that these people were put down. And you're trying to present a kind of different perception of what this is in terms of actually this wasn't just, gangsters engaging in criminality, but reflected actually people actually trying to maintain a way of life that was under attack rather than, attacking quote unquote civilization.
For sure. And also to note that these were popular movements. So again, the idea that like to be a Texan and Texan values are things like free enterprise and private property. These weren't ideas or values that were kind of homegrown. They were pretty brutally enforced. And one thing that has been, that I get into in the book is you can actually look at the ways that people were writing about this fence cutting episode, for example. So you can read plenty of newspaper articles, which I cite many in the book, where people who are writing in defense of fence cutting were using words like private property, were using words like capitalism. In fact, words like socialism and communism were used, oftentimes were invoked in defense of these kind of activities. So, this idea that Texas has like a certain perspective, Texans have a certain historical perspective on private property is wrong. It's much more complicated. And the way that kind of became maybe more mainstream was, again, not some kind of natural outgrowth, but something that was put in place by the powers that be. So the hope with the book is, to kind of encourage people to look at and reclaim these kind of longstanding traditions in Texas politics, but to also understand that, whenever anybody says like a group of people, their nature is this or their nature is that, that's often an attempt to kind of push a very specific narrative and set of values on people. It doesn't always match up with the historical record.
I think this is such a interesting endeavor and an interesting untangling of myth, because think about the mythos of the American West and how that historical West has been flattened, and one might get the idea that, say, like a free range cowboy and a Texas Ranger are quote unquote on the same side and quote unquote taming the American West. But here we have a quite obvious we have a quite obvious conflict between these two parties, and that it wasn't all hunky-dory American expansion to the West, and that there was quite a bit of complication and nuance and social and political growth throughout this whole process and settling a place as large and wild as Texas. Could you talk a little bit more about, I believe we talked about the 1883 cowboy strike last time you were on. That seemed like a good place to, that challenges that familiar image of this American cowboy as this rugged individualist. And instead we have this story of cowboys working together in order to flex their political and social power. What did that episode reveal about solidarity in this era of Texas history and how that echoes forward into the 20th century?
Yeah. I mean, so the great cowboy strike of 1883, is one of the kind of early stories that I tell in the book. And Mark Laus has a wonderful book from Verso that really goes into that history and also how it kind of spread across the West. But it's a very fascinating story because the quick version of it is that cowboy work is changing. There is a kind of a new group of bosses and landlords and landowners coming into the state of Texas. And they start to kind of challenge the old way of doing cowboy work, notably by banning the practice of mavericking. Mavericking was, people would call maverick unmarked cattle, they would call that a maverick. And tradition kind of went that if you were a working cowboy and you saw a maverick out on the trail, you were able to kind of claim it as your own. So you would work your boss's herd, but you were able to kind of start to develop your own. And the bosses and the landlords started to see this as competition. So they banned that practice. And they start changing the way that cowboy work had been done, really turning it into a system more of like wage labor. And as this is happening, some of the cowboys start to realize that their rights and privileges might disappear. So the cowboy strike is actually led by the wagon bosses, Thomas B. Harris being one of the most prominent ones. And the wagon bosses, they were the kind of the manager, I guess, of the other cowboys, and they were the ones who would interface and interact with both the bosses and also with the merchants. So they were a more privileged worker. They were paid better. But they actually start organizing the people more towards the bottom end of the wage spectrum and the payment spectrum, because they realized that as those systems, as those people start to get paid less, as their protections disappear, sooner or later would come for them. So they organized themselves into a kind of proto-union. And this is where the historical narrative and the reality really break. So the way this is oftentimes told is these cowboys try to organize themselves into a union, but solidarity and union organizing don't really fit in with the rugged individualism of the cowboy. So they all got drunk in the saloon and they spent their strike fund and they all had to go back to work hat in hand. Nothing could be further from the truth. What ends up happening is not only do these cowboys win their strike, they win it so quickly because they decide to go on strike at the very beginning of the cattle drive. And the cattle drive is one of those things where the earlier you're able to get your cattle to market, the higher price you get. So it's a real time-sensitive thing. And the cowboys end up using a very tried and tested aspect of labor organizing, which is, the strategic strike. So they're able to force the bosses to accept their demands. What ends up happening is the bosses in the next season utilize the blacklist, basically not hiring people who are members of the union. There's a big attempt to do union busting. And, the Cowboys eventually kind of lose those gains that they won. But this isn't a story of, cowboying work being incongruent with like solidarity or the unions, this is a kind of an old American story of union busting and duplicitous tactics by the bosses and the business owners. And why is it that we have such a kind of separate understanding of this from the historical reality? Is because most of the historians who would look at this would look into this story would go through the memoirs of the big landowners. So like some of their daughters would write, histories of the family ranch. And those stories are always like, yeah, my ancestor was very good at kind of defeating these upstart cowboys. But the federal government actually recorded the strike when it happened in 1883 as a victory and listed specifically the wage demands that the cowboys put to the bosses. So there's plenty of historical evidence that these cowboys were able to win the strike. And again, this is another one of those stories where the kind of popular historical narrative has been kind of shifted from what actually happened on the ground. And I will just note really quickly that you want to talk about romance of the Old West. Billy the Kid is kind of passing through Tascosa, Texas, where this all goes down. And a few years later, another figure from Billy the Kid's legend, Pat Garrett. People will know Pat Garrett as the man who shot Billy the Kid. Pat Garrett was actually hired by the bosses to come after and harass the cowboys who led the strike, and it's kind of come after them and harass them over the next few years. So, we talk a lot about romance in the West and the kind of the end of the outlaw life, but I find that it's kind of interesting that the same figures in Pat Garrett, who kind of killed off the outlaw, also were used to kind of bust unions and to come after people who engage in solidarity. And that's probably something that would be a little bit better for us to be romantic about than, train robbers and the like.
So, part of your book talks about the radical political traditions that came out of Texas during this period. You mentioned them at the top, the rise of the populists, and then later the Socialist Party. Both movements, especially with the socialists, we associate socialism with immigrants from New York City, and radicals in Chicago are not usually places like Texas. So I guess the question I have here is a kind of a two-part question. It's like, what is the origins of this populist wave and then this socialist wave? How did those waves kind of differ from each other? What was the difference between a populist and a socialist? And then how did, this combination of corporate power, landowners, and state political elites, how did they work together to suppress these more organized forms of political activism?
Yeah, so so the populist movement comes first, and it comes out of organizations of farmers in Texas who begin to start asking themselves the question: why is it that those who work most get least, and those who work least get most? This question is posed by S.O. Dawes, who's one of the early leaders of the this kind of farmers' rebellion, and there's a whole period of them trying to organize and get concessions from the merchant class, from the banking class, and from the government. But eventually they realize that they need to organize themselves into a political movement to be able to change the lives of the farmers. What's really unique about Texas, I think, compared to other agrarian movements in Europe or even in the United States, to be frank, was the way that a lot of these farmers start to see themselves as members of the working class. So this agrarian movement very quickly builds alliances with organizations like the Knights of Labor and with industrial workers. So the People's Party, even though its kind of heart is with the farmers and this agrarian movement, it's pretty expansive in its kind of understanding of itself, which allowed it to have a pretty vibrant a chapter in both again rural Texas and in the major cities as Texas becomes more and more of a railroad hub. So this movement kind of fights its way into being seen as a major player. It ends up overtaking the Republican Party as the second major party in Texas, and they elect a whole host of populists to the state legislature. And in 1896, in fact, I argue, as do many other scholars, that the gubernatorial election of a populist candidate, Jerome Kirby, was stolen by the Democratic Party. And there's plenty of evidence of ballot box stuffing, of intimidation at the polls. with basically refusing to allow people to vote. And, officially, they only lost that election by, I believe, around 50,000 votes. So that's the official tally, but the reality is likely that they won that election. So the populist movement ends up being very powerful in Texas. It also forces the Democratic Party to start taking on a bunch of concessions. There's different aspects of it. There's a radical wing, which is questioning things like capitalism. There's a more conservative wing of the movement that are a little bit more well off than the average agrarian worker at the time. But this leads to a kind of a final fight between the radicals and the conservatives, and the conservatives end up returning to the Democratic Party. One thing that's really notable about the populists is it was also an interracial movement. Now, I don't want to sugarcoat it. There were plenty of aspects of populism that were quite odious. But when it comes to a political movement in Texas, there probably was no organization as viable as populism that was as serious as kind of speaking to and fighting for the needs of African Americans, which led to an aspect of populism that it had a pretty strong showing in African American communities. And especially towards the end of the 1890s, this alliance between poor whites and poor blacks, I think, really starts to threaten the powers that be in Texas and the Democratic Party. And it is after the populist uprising, after the success of the populists, that you actually start seeing the restrictions on the vote for black people, as well as restrictions on the vote for white people, using things like the poll tax and literacy tests. Also disenfranchised many poor whites as well. So there's a response from the powers that be to try to prevent populism from coming into power, both by outright rigging of the elections and then by restricting democracy full on. The movement that follows this is socialism. And to use maybe a little bit of an academic metaphor, Martin Irons, who's a very famous Texan labor leader, railroad leader, who was not an educated man, used this metaphor that populists were like juniors and socialists are seniors. And one of the things that is kind of notable between the populists and the socialists was that there were many populists became socialists, and because of their experience in populism, started to take a more radical, revolutionary, and anti-capitalist approach to politics. Now, all this is happening at the same time as a kind of activation of a lot of Texas's immigrant population, as you noted, Djene. Texas has a very large German and also a very large Czech population. A lot of these came from radical communities in Germany. So there is a kind of a German socialism that's a part of Texas socialism. But what's notable is that this kind of two-track, this German socialism that existed in Central Texas in a lot of these German-speaking communities, is developing politically at the same time as this socialism of the kind of Southerners, of both white and black Southerners who moved to Texas or were from Texas. So there's like a homegrown socialism that is merging then with that kind of European socialism that had been coming into Texas over the years. And the Texas Socialist Party grows into a very significant organization. The Rebel is their newspaper. It has a significant distribution across the state of Texas. And because it had that, it allowed the party to really grow across this large state, which, as we all know, not to be cliche, Texas is big. Everybody knows this. So it allowed them to really grow, in addition to this system of encampments. And encampments are a really interesting Texas tradition, where in the summer months, people, particularly people who are cotton farmers, it was a slower time of the year, so they would have these large gatherings, and literally some of these numbered in the thousands. And socialist politicians like Eugene Debs or figures like Mother Jones would come, and they would give lectures and speeches to thousands of farmers. And Eugene Debs spoke really eloquently on an almost spiritual level about how much these encampments meant to the Texas socialist movement. And these events were, one, political education, political organizing movements, but there was also just a lot of socializing. Obviously, there's barbecue, good music, swimming, dancing, and there was also a big movement to helping people with literacy. Texas obviously was a state where a lot of poor people weren't literate, and the Texas Socialist Party played a big role in trying to help people learn how to read. And there's certainly people today who have ancestors in Texas who their family members were probably first taught how to read by a socialist at one of these encampments. And the way that this kind of was, this movement really engaged in a kind of really beautiful and rich social life, as well as kind of got into religion. One thing that was really notable about the Texas Socialist Party was its relationship with Christianity, particularly a very Baptist and evangelical version of Christianity that ends up allowing it to be a fairly effective movement. And the last thing I would just note here about the understanding Texas socialism, if anybody is familiar with the history of the Socialist Party of the U.S., there was a tension between the Texas chapter and the rest of the party, particularly on the question of whether or not farmers are workers. There was a large part, particularly section of the party, particularly in the Northeast, who didn't see these people as proletarian, to use the Marxist terminology. And one of the kind of unique aspects of the Texas movement was requesting that socialists be able to kind of bob and weave theoretically instead of just kind of looking at the world in a dogmatic way. And my book is probably the only book about Texas history that has long quotations from Karl Kautsky, where I kind of go back and forth with him about the theoretical question about whether or not agrarian workers or farmers should be considered members of the working class.
David, this is a fascinating topic. We are out of time. Where can listeners find your work if they're looking to go deeper on this subject?
Yeah, appreciate it. Well, one, I mean, you can pick up the book, The Myth of Red Texas. It's especially helpful for us if you get it from OR Books, but you can get it anywhere that books are found. I also have a Substack called The Rattler, where I write about Texas radical history as well as politics. And you can also listen to me on my podcast, Left Reckoning, or on the Jacobin Magazine YouTube show, The Jacobin Show. And really so great speaking with y'all.
Yeah, thank you again for joining us. And thank you, listener, for joining us for Talking History, a presentation of KSMU and the Missouri State University Department of History. You can catch us every first Thursday at 12:06 after NPR News. This show is available along with our entire back catalog at ksmu.org or wherever podcasts are found.